Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello, Madam Secretary.
Hi.
Thank you for being with us. So I think we all know that the pandemic has had a especially disproportionate impact on women, not only here domestically, but around the world. In fact, there was a recent World Economic Forum report that said the pandemic has increased the global gender gap by a generation, which means now that this is sort of ridiculous. Women must wait for gender parity to close the gender gap. It jumped from 100 to 136 years. It wasn't really good before, right? So the question is, can you highlight some of the aspects of your budget requests that will help advance women around the world, and especially those in developing countries?
Well, as you noted, the pandemic has had a disproportionately negative effect on women in the United States and all around the world. And we're supporting relief efforts from the pandemic all around the world, especially in the lowest income countries, very actively through aid of the type I've discussed: vaccine distribution, economic aid, debt relief, and the favorable impact of that will accrue disproportionately to women. But beyond that, we've worked with the multilateral development banks and with the IMF in over a number of years now to focus more heavily on women's issues and women's empowerment. It's something that Treasury, as a shareholder in those institutions, has pushed to do, to have a focus on women's issues and women's security in the area of health, particularly to focus specifically on women's health issues. And I think some progress is being made. It certainly is a focus of our work with those institutions.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we're all here. We're alarmed by, again, the recent violence between Israel and Hamas. And to make it clear, there's no equivalency between the two. Hamas is a terrorist organization. And although I definitely support humanitarian relief to Palestinians, as long as the relief is not used in a terrorist or negative way, I would like to know what role does the Treasury Department play in implementing sanctions or to limit support to Hamas? Or what role could you play?
Well, we do play an important role there. Hamas has been designated as a target of the U.S. government counterterrorism sanction programs. We prioritize targeting Hamas and their supporters, including operational and political leadership, operatives, financiers, investors, and key global procurement networks. We have targeted a large number of Hamas-affiliated individuals and entities around the globe, and that includes a host of charities around the world that have served as critical fundraising mechanisms. We also work closely with jurisdictions that are vulnerable to Hamas's illicit financial networks. That includes partners in the Gulf. We work with them to improve their anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism frameworks. We provide assessments of the state of Hamas's finances and work with foreign partners as well on sanctions designations.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Fordberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you so much for appearing with us today. We appreciate your time. Madam Secretary, the World Health Organization's credibility is on the line. When the pandemic first hit, the reports or the theory that this was leaked out of the Wuhan lab were roundly dismissed by experts. Now we have some credible intelligence that we shouldn't be so fast to dismiss that theory. But again, the World Health Organization is entangled in this as well. And given that you oversee funding to them, what are you doing to engage with the World Health Organization, the WHO, to clarify what it knew and when regarding the growing evidence that the virus may have leaked from the Wuhan lab?
Congressman, I think we're not directly involved in that investigation or in overseeing the World Health Organization. I mean, we do a lot of work on health through our representation in the World Bank and the IMF and others, but we're not directly involved with the World Health Organization. I'm certainly aware of the point that you made, and I know President Biden has asked for an investigation into what happened in that episode, but I think we're not directly involved in that.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for clarifying that. Let me speak to you as well about China on another topic. China is by far the largest creditor to low-income countries across the world. Now, are you aware how much China gives in direct humanitarian assistance and payments to multilateral funds to which they belong? The United States, just on humanitarian assistance, gives away about $25 billion. And China's development strategy, frankly, is this. It's predatory lending, it's resource extraction, and it's payment to authoritarian regimes. So in that regard, what are you working to assure that U.S. funds and other multilateral funds are not being used by debtor nations to pay off Chinese debt? This would be an indirect subsidy to Chinese debt obligations by the United States and others.
Well, I think that's a real concern, and it's one that we have, particularly in the context of our debt relief programs that we have arranged, the debt suspension initiative and the common framework, which is a framework for reducing, writing off some debt that's unsustainable for very low-income countries. So we have spoken with China about their participation. They have promised to participate as equal partners in these debt frameworks. We would be very concerned to see resources that are provided to these countries used to repay Chinese debt. That would defeat the purpose of the programs. Not all of there are entities within China that do lending that have not fully participated in these efforts, and that concerns us, and we have spoken to the Chinese about it. But this is a very valid concern, and it's one we're looking through. You know, transparency is also an important way of ensuring that funds aren't misused.
Well, I appreciate your sensitivity to this. It sounds like we need better parameters around it, that we're at the sort of the beginning of this question, and then putting an implementation process to ensure that our subsidies to multilateral funds or assistance aren't going to pay off Chinese debt. That's egregious. Let me turn to the other question, though. Are you aware of how much China gives in humanitarian assistance and to the multilateral funds that we all belong to?
They certainly contribute. I don't have any figures on that in front of me.
I think that's the point. Is we need a baseline on this, because again, China has this hybrid capitalistic communistic system that has caused grievous concerns around the world in terms of resource exploitation, lacks labor standards, lacks environmental standards, and then tries to achieve leadership positions in the very funds that go to clean up its messes many times. That's the point. Maybe we can return to it, Madam Secretary. Thank you.
It's an important issue. I agree with you.
Thank you.
Torres.
Thank you, Chairman, and good afternoon, Secretary Yellen. Thank you for being with us today. As you're aware, I am deeply concerned about democratic backsliding and blatant disregard for the rule of law in the Northern Triangle of Central America. And as an appropriator, I feel strongly that we must ensure our U.S. taxpayers' dollars help the people and does not go against our policy objectives. We cannot directly or indirectly prop up wannabe dictators and allow these loans to support their attacks on democracy. Looking to El Salvador, in April of 2020, the IMF approved El Salvador's request for emergency financial assistance of about $389 million US dollars under the rapid financing instrument to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. That is not a small sum of money. The emergency assistance came from the commitment from El Salvador's government, and I quote, remain committed to strengthen competitiveness by improving the business environment, reduce public debt, combat corruption, and strengthen the financial supervision and regulatory framework, and the governance and anti-money laundering, counter financing of terrorism frameworks. The staff report also notes that the president assigned the International Commission Against Impunity in El Salvador, also known as CISES, to inspect the COVID-19 emergency funds and nominated a committee in charge and accountable for administering the fund. Unfortunately, El Salvador's newly installed Attorney General Counsel CISES, after that body, referred 12 cases of potential corruption and procurement fraud to the former Attorney General, including misuse of funds for COVID relief purchases by the Ministry of Health. This was after the Legislative Assembly already passed a law granting immunity for COVID-related contracts. So my questions are, has your team and your colleagues at the IMF seen reports from CISES on how this money was spent per the commitment that was made? And if not, will you be requesting these reports and additional information? And given recent developments and the government's clear efforts to avoid accountability and shield corrupt, are you confident that this money was spent as intended?
So you've asked a question that I need to do some research in order to give you a satisfactory answer. I mean, I'm certainly aware of the money that went to El Salvador. It was, as I understand it, mainly intended to help with COVID-19 and as budget support to strengthen fiscal reforms. I'm not knowledgeable about all of the details you just gave, and I'd be glad to get back to you or have my staff meet with you to review this situation.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate, you following up from our last meeting. I had a briefing with your folks, ensuring that we are utilizing all the tools at our disposal to file sanctions against corrupt individuals. That has to be a priority when 70 cents of every dollar spent in the region, goes to corrupt hands. We must be eyes wide open at ensuring that we are protecting, this money. With that, I hope that we have a second round. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Price, thank you very much
for steering our very important committee hearing and for your leadership. Really appreciate you filling
Certainly.
for it.
Glad you're back.
Now, I think I'm yielding now to Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lee. I appreciate it, and good to see you back. I appreciate it. So as everybody knows, the Biden administration supports a $650 billion allocation to IMF member nations for special drawing rights. These are, as you know, Secretary Yellen, known as SDRs. This funding is disguised as aid to low-income countries. This aid is disguised as aid to low-income countries, but the money actually goes to support nations carrying out genocide, terrorism, and even war crimes. And Secretary Yellen, you and I are in agreement on SDRs. You were quoted as saying that SDRs are, and I quote, an extremely inefficient way to deliver foreign aid since the money goes mostly to G20 countries that have no need for this, end quote. So Secretary Yellen, just my time's limited, yes or no. Would a new allocation of SDRs, could that money be sent to countries like China or Russia?
Those countries will receive allocations, but it's very unlikely that either country will use the allocation. Russia.
Secretary Yellen, I'm going to reclaim my time. So yes, China and Russia will get an allocation. We can talk about recycling later. But now, yes or no, if sanctions are removed from Iran, U.S. taxpayer dollars could be sent to the Iranian regime with SDRs, right?
I'm sorry. Could you say that again?
If sanctions on Iran are removed, if the sanctions are removed, U.S. taxpayer dollars could go to support the Iranian regime through SDRs.
I mean, Iran is a net holder of SDRs, but to use them, they would need to find a country that is willing to supply them with hard currency. And
sure.
US
Reclaiming my
and
time.
most countries would not do that.
Reclaiming my time. I'm sure the Chinese would make an exception to Iran. Yes or no, these SDRs will benefit the Burmese generals with millions of dollars in foreign aid following their military coup and slaughter of innocent people. Yes or no?
No, Burma will not be able to use its SDRs. When a government is taken power by force, the IMF will not transact with it unless a majority of IMF shareholders say they recognize the government, and that hasn't happened.
Secretary Yellen, from my understanding, there are no conditions on SDRs. So because there are no conditions, this money could go to the generals that committed a coup, it could go to other nefarious actors.
They will not be able to access them unless a majority of IMF shareholders say that they recognize the Burmese government, and that has not happened.
But
they will not be allowed to do it.
It is possible. Additionally, SDR allocation could go to bail out financially mismanaged countries like Lebanon, for example. Yes or no?
I'm not sure of the situation with Lebanon, but countries get SDR allocations.
The money will also go to Lebanon. Yes or no? American adversaries alone will receive more money than low-income countries through the SDR allocation, correct?
Well, the lowest income countries will get about $21 billion worth of SDRs, and emerging markets and developing countries, excluding China, will get about a third of the allocation, or about a little bit over.
Secretary Yellen, as you said, so low-income countries will actually get less than 10% of this money. As you just said, they'll get $21 billion. Our adversaries will get collectively $68 billion. Even if you take out China in that calculation, this will greatly enhance our adversaries and other G20 actors that frankly don't need the money. Are you aware that you would need congressional approval to allocate anything above $650 billion of SDRs?
I can't remember exactly what the cutoff is, but yes.
And do you think that's maybe why that you're trying to be under $650 billion so that you can push this money out without congressional approval?
Well, we try to evaluate what the global reserve needs are, and we work with the IMF to do that. And
So,
thought
so
that
you're
this
telling me that
was,
we're borrowing money, we're sending it to our adversaries, we're sending it to mismanaged countries that mismanage their budgets, we're sending it to G20 countries that don't need it, also that your administration does not need congressional approval to do a special allocation. Is that correct?
well, it is almost a costless thing to do to allocate SDRs. In the first instance, there's no cost at all. And if we agree to exchange SDRs for hard currency for a country that comes to us, and we're not obligated to do that. But if
Secretary,
we
yeah,
do
even the
it,
Wall Street Journal calls this monetary alchemy. There is a true cost. If there weren't a true cost and it was neutral, we would just give like trillions and trillions of dollars out. The reason there's a true cost is because if we're lending this money at, let's say, 2.3% interest over 30 years and interest rates spike, which the yield rates
we,
probably will spike,
we,
we'll
we,
lose the
we,
opportunity cost.
we receive interest, we pay interest on issuing Treasury debt, we receive interest from countries that acquire the SDRs. So
you're not counting
it's
for risk
virtually
of
a
default.
wash.
You're not,
There's no,
yeah,
there
with
isn't
respect,
risk.
you're not counting for risk, which
There
these countries
isn't,
could default. You're also not accounting for
it's not,
the yield, steep yield curve with inflation. With all due, even the Wall Street Journal has called this monetary alchemy.
I need to yield now to Ms. May.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Madam Secretary, it's an honor to have you here today, and thank you so much for your work. I have a few questions, and I will try to be respectful and allow you time to actually answer these complex questions that members on both sides of the aisle are asking, knowing that yes or no won't suffice. So my first question is about Hezbollah financing. While programs to combat terrorist financing are funded through FSGG, I did want to take a minute to ask about Hezbollah's financing, particularly using cryptocurrency. In August 2020, the Department of Justice announced the seizure of 300 cryptocurrency accounts, including 150 that laundered funds to and from accounts of Hamas's al-Qassam brigades. Additionally, the Wall Street Journal reported that Hamas has seen a surge in cryptocurrency donations since early May. And the report cited a Hamas official who admitted that cryptocurrency is becoming a larger proportion of the group's revenue. Wanted to ask what steps the Department of Treasury is taking to address the growing threat of terrorist financing through cryptocurrencies and other digital assets, and how will innovations and technologies in the financial industry, particularly cryptocurrency, impact transnational terrorist groups and plots against the U.S. and our allies?
well, cryptocurrencies are often used by illicit actors who were trying to escape detection in moving funds. And so it does pose challenges, but a core part of Treasury's mission is to impede and immobilize funds. When sanctions are in place, we have sanctions targeting Hamas and Hezbollah and their supporters. And we've designated a large number of Hamas and Hezbollah individuals and so-called shadow bankers that have helped Hezbollah move money, particularly through the Lebanese financial system. And while cryptocurrencies pose challenges, this is the core work of Treasury and its sanction regimes.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Wanted to ask, switching gears, different question about the climate plan. The directive announcing $20 billion from the administration to develop an Amazon climate financing plan for an important forest region of our world. As you know, tropical and intact forests play a critical role in both mitigation carbon emissions and adapting to the impacts of ecological disruption from climate change and biodiversity loss. What progress has the administration made in developing a climate finance plan for tropical and intact forests in the Amazon, the Andean, Amazon, 5 forest regions of Central America, and elsewhere?
I probably have to get back with you on details on that, Congresswoman. I can tell you that our Tropical Forest and Coral Reef Conservation Act is something that we have been using to enable countries that are eligible to redirect debt payments to support tropical forest and coral reef ecosystems. I know we have a number of agreements. We're really running out of areas that where we can expand, where we have official bilateral debt. But maybe I can get back to you with more details on what we're doing in some of the countries that you asked about.
Great. And in addition, and you were mentioning the Tropical Forest and Coral Reef Conservation Act, would love to hear about some of the timelines on completing negotiations on the different swaps in the pipeline. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Okay, Madam Secretary, I believe you have a hard stop at 3:30 Eastern time. So I'm going to ask members to comply with our 3-minute time frame so that everyone can get in a second round of questions at 3 minutes. So I will start, Madam Secretary, by just asking you about the budget request to pay down U.S. unmet commitments to various international financial institutions, which total over $2 billion. These arrears damage U.S. credibility and really cede influence to countries like China and Russia. So I'd like to just know what the plan is for catching up with our payments, and why prioritizing paying down these arrears now when these funds could support other programs such as food security, global health, and what have you. So we just like to hear your take on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lee. We believe that sustained U.S. leadership can only occur if other countries know that we meet our commitments. And we currently have $2.7 billion worth of unmet commitments. Some of that dates back to the 1990s. And really what we've seen over many years is that these unmet commitments just undermine our credibility and the role that we could play in leadership. So we've requested a start. We've requested $489 million to reduce the unmet commitments we have. We're focusing the paying down of unmet commitments to IDA, to the African Development Fund, and to the Asian Development Fund, which are the concessional arms of multilateral development banks that really go toward helping the poorest countries that are in need. And when we make these payments of previous commitments, they immediately enhance the ability of these banks to fund projects in the poorest countries. So they are augmenting the resources that are available for those purposes. Sorry, I mean, we hope in future years to pay down further unmet commitments, but we think that this is a reasonable start and moves us in the right direction.
Okay, thank you, Madam Secretary. I will just ask this question. You don't need to respond, so I can yield to Mr. Rogers, but I'm curious about the Treasury's role in helping to advance the sustainable development goals through our multilateral partnerships. And so I'm going to offline or in a written response, written question, ask you to respond to that question. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Ranking Member Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, the United States has not contributed to the Green Climate Fund 2017, and the fund has not been the subject of extensive oversight in Washington since that time. I understand that funding for the U.S. contribution is intended to come from both Departments of State and Treasury. Which agency will oversee the fund, and how much is, or how is that oversight conducted? And with what degree of regularity and specificity are the results with this committee?
So in this year's budget request, the administration has asked for $625 million on behalf of Treasury for the Green Climate Fund and an equal amount on behalf of State Department. So the total request for the Green Climate Fund is divided between Treasury and State. Apologies. We work closely with the Green Climate Fund. We have an outstanding commitment to the fund. In 2014, the United States pledged $3 billion to the fund. We believe strongly in the work that they do, and that it's the centerpiece really of providing impactful and innovative climate finance to the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries. And we conduct oversight in connection with our contributions to the fund.
Well, what I'm wanting to know is who is going to oversee that fund that we can turn to ask questions? Is it State or is it Treasury? Or
we do it jointly with State, where we jointly represent the United States in the fund, Treasury and State.
what steps have been taken to strengthen transparency, accountability, anti-corruption, public oversight in this climate finance governance?
Well, there have been issues that have risen in connection with the governance of the fund and management shortcomings. And, we have worked with other board members and management to try to address issues that have arisen. The executive director has replaced over the last year the head of human resources, hired an ombudsperson, and we've been active with other members of the board to look for those management improvements.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. How are you?
Thank you. Now I'd like to yield to Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, I'm happy for the chance to ask you another question. I promise you I will not demand a yes or no answer. Seems to be that kind of tactic. We've just seen the demonstration of how unhelpful that is at a hearing involving complex questions. I will share with you what I have sometimes said to people who demand such an answer in my town meetings. I have said to them, if you don't tell me how to answer the question, I promise you I won't tell you how to ask it. You might, that occasionally works, not always. So about the health work of these international financial institutions, I'd like to give you a chance to elaborate on that. Wonder what your assessment might be in general of the international financial institutions' response to the pandemic. Have some been more successful than others in their response? Have they coordinated it successfully? I'm particularly interested in vaccine distribution, and maybe the World Bank is the appropriate focal point here. Are there additional steps the World Bank should be taking to financially support COVAX? What additional steps could they take in coordination, of course, with USAID, Gavi, the World Health Organization? What are some additional steps that might help us make sure that low-income countries are prepared to deliver large numbers of vaccine doses later this year?
So we've worked very closely with the World Bank and the multilateral development banks to address the impact of the crisis, and particularly to make sure that funding is available for vaccine purchase. The World Bank is, I can't give you the exact figure, but I believe the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and Inter-American Development Bank have collectively provided over $20 billion for the purchase of vaccines. They have worked collaboratively with COVAX. Their support programs go beyond vaccine purchase to PPE, distribution of vaccines, and other medical supplies. So there has been a joint effort to provide vaccines, to speed the delivery of vaccines. And the World Bank is also beginning to provide critical financing for vaccine manufacturing as well. In our judgment, vaccine manufacturing capacity is a significant bottleneck to increasing global vaccine access. And we've been working with the World Bank and with our partners in ACT-A to address supply chain bottlenecks there. The IFC has supported vaccine manufacturing efforts in both Africa and Asia. And quite recently, they invested in South Africa to boost manufacturing efforts there. So these organizations have been, I think, very active and effective in using their resources to address the pandemic.
Thank you. And of course, we all know what kind of redoubled effort is going to be required here. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to yield to Mr. Diaz-Bayard.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Madam Secretary, while logic and common sense and much evidence shows a potential lab leak, Wuhan lab leak, you already mentioned, obviously, that there is an investigation underway, and I understand that, but as to where it came from. But what is clear is what the Chinese regime did. A report in Quarterly Review of Biophysics, Biophysics Discovery found that the PRC used, quote, deliberate destruction, concealment, or contamination of data. Chinese scientists who wish to share their knowledge have not been able to do so or have disappeared. And we know lots and lots and lots of reports about that. So while the investigation is taking place as to whether it was a lab leak or not, what is not debatable, I think, at this stage is that the Chinese regime held information, covered up. So here's the question. Are you looking at sanctioning those responsible, not for the leak, because I understand that part's still an investigation, but for the cover-up? It's pretty evident that the Chinese regime did a very extensive cover-up of what actually was taking place. So are you looking at sanctioning those who may have been responsible for the cover-up?
So I think it will be up to the president when he sees the results of the investigations that are taking place to craft an appropriate response. And sanctions is always an available or typically an available tool that might be on that list. To the best of my knowledge, no decisions have been made yet.
Okay, I know, and I get that, and you answered the question that no decision has been made yet. But again, I just would note that there is, I don't think, very much in dispute as far as the fact that the disappearance of scientists, journalists, doctor like Yusen Zhou, Ai-Fen, Li Wenliang, Fang Bin, Louise Zehao, Chen Guixi, and others who have died, and the cover-up. So I just hope that you would be aggressive. And I get the investigation, my understanding is as to whether it was a lab leak or not, but the cover-up, it seems to me that there's a lot of evidence already. So I would hope that you would have the opportunity to look at that. And I appreciate you doing so. And again, with that, I'll yield back. Thank you.
I'd like to yield to Ms. Frankel.
Okay, I was going to yield and let some of the other members ask a question. I do have one question for you. And again, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So as you think about all this, you know, what do you see as really the most important thing right now that you as Treasury Secretary, your agency can bring some economic vibrance back to the international community?
So on many different dimensions, we are determined to reestablish U.S. leadership in international organizations and to work constructively, collaboratively with our partners to address issues of global scope where we can really only make progress if we cooperate. And that includes such issues as poverty and the impact of the pandemic, the debt problems of low-income countries. Absolutely, climate change is very high on our list of areas where we're providing leadership to collaborate with other countries that, as we do, see climate change as an existential threat. So I think our partners around the world know we're back at the table. We value their collaboration with them in addressing matters of common concern. And we're coming to the table with leadership, with resources, and with effort to address common challenges.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you. Now I'd like to yield to Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, I think this might be a helpful exercise that if we listed every multilateral fund that we are a participant in, along with other countries and their contribution, along with the benefits that are received by a list of countries, and then this more specifically, the governance structure. This is the broader point. What are we doing internally to watch governance structures in these organizations to ensure that they are reflective of our values propositions, the very reasons, the missions that we are participating in these multilateral funds, and that they aren't redirected, so to speak, by other countries that have massive economies like China. China is making plays for leadership in multilateral institutions all over the world, but these funds tend to get overlooked in this regard. That's the first question. I think that would be a very helpful exercise to actually have this down on paper, but also go fund by fund and address the government structures. Do you have a system internally to do that?
We are served typically on the boards of these institutions and are shareholders of them. And Treasury very actively is involved in the governance of all of these funds, down to the project level. I believe my staff told me that we reviewed something like 1,700 projects last year to make sure that the design of these projects and the values in it meet our own governance standards, that we concerned with anti-corruption. We're concerned about the impact that projects may have on Indigenous people, or particularly on women, and that we're very active in making sure that we're funding projects that will make a real contribution to reducing poverty, addressing human needs.
Madam Secretary, thank you so much for the answer. I just have a few moments left. Let me give you a specific example as well. The Global Environment Facility, we fund them in the hundreds of millions of each year. I've been a supporter of their programs. I think they do tremendous work. The point being, though, I get concerned that we don't do enough internally to make sure that our case, our vision, and the possibility of shifting visions toward a more holistic approach to environmental health and security simply gets fragmented as we're looking at individual programs and projects. So the metrics by which we are determining the investment outcome of our money and the governance structures, I think I'm trying to get a better feel for how robust we're doing that.
Well, Madam Secretary, Ms. Fortenberry, could the Secretary respond to you in writing, because we have one more member to ask.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'd be glad to do that.
Congresswoman Torres.
Thank you again, Secretary Yellen. I want to quickly say thank you again to you and your OFAC team for its engagement with me and commitment to work with state and others to increase the quantity and effectiveness of the global Magnitsky sanctions for the Northern Triangle. President Biden recently rightly highlighted corruption as a national security priority, and the creation of a regional anti-corruption task force for the Northern Triangle countries of Central America should put into action. I was also thrilled to see Treasury's budget justification include a little over 185 million, of which not less than 3 million is for addressing human rights violations and corruption, including activities authorized by the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability. Secretary Yellen, of that request for additional staffing, how many new staff members will be dedicated to Central America to meet this new mandate of the Biden administration?
It's a good question. I promise to come back to you with details on that, Congresswoman.
Yes, I appreciate you so much and your eagerness to work with our office. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Well, Madam Secretary, first of all, thank you so much for spending time with us today and for your testimony. I think our members have learned a heck of a lot from you as it relates to our responsibility and partnership with the Department of Treasury. It really was a very informative hearing. It's really important that we stand by our commitments to our multilateral partners and show that the United States does not believe in go it alone policy or approach to addressing some of the toughest global challenges. Finally, let me just say to members, if you have any questions that you'd like to submit for the record, please submit them to the subcommittee within the next 7 days. So this concludes today's hearing. The Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations and Related Programs stays adjourned. Again, Madam Secretary, we really appreciate the time you spent with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman. Thank you.